Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming to our Science, Conservation and Humanities seminar. We have them here every Friday morning, and every Friday morning we have another interesting topic that connects the sciences and humanities related to the plant world. And today we'll have an interesting research, Plants, People and Languages, exploring connections between linguistic diversity and biodiversity, with Dr. David Harrison having this important conversation with us. I'm lucky to be the director of the Humanities Institute and always hosting these phenomenal Mellon visiting scholars. And every year they bring a completely different topic to the fore and use our collections in a very surprising way. And today's scholar is definitely no exception and stands out for his research being completely intercollaborational here at the garden, involving the herbarium in the Department of Ethnobotany and many other departments. But you don't have to take my word for this. We have Mike Balick himself, who is guiding the research in Vanuatu, and will say a first word, will say the introductory word about David Harrison and his research. And Mike Balick is the Vice President for Botanical Science, the Director and Philology Curator of the Institute of Economic Botany. Yes. That's a word for, oh yeah, thank you.
David, Greg, Plunkett, and I have been PIs on this wonderful project in Vanuatu. I think you'll talk a little bit about that today, but rolling the tape backwards, it's a pleasure to introduce David Harrison. He's been a colleague for 4 or 5 years now. We've worked a lot together. I've learned a great deal, as I think you have, Greg. He's added remarkable dimensions to our biodiversity studies, as you'll hear. David graduated from the American University and then went on to Yale to work with the great anthropologist, linguist, ethnographer, Hal Conklin, who was one of the greatest of his generation. David wrote a wonderful book. He's written several. I recommend this one, When Languages Die, The Extinction of the World's Languages and the Erosion of Human Knowledge. David's one of the world's specialists in endangered languages, and he's worked with hundreds of different language groups. Some speakers are gone now, but extinct languages. He'll tell you about that. But it's really, it's just added so much to what we do here, and it's amazing. David can collect 1,000 lexemes in a day when we collect 40 plants. So it's kind of interesting, the cadence of the research. And you are a professor at Swarthmore University. You're the co-founder of Living Tongues Institute for Endangered Languages. And recently, David was the associate provost of Swarthmore University. And that's a job where everybody's so grateful to you that you have to take a 2-year sabbatical after you retire from that job. So David is with us at the Institute of Economic Botany, as Vanessa said, in Humanities Institute. David.
Thank you, Vanessa and Mike, for that introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here. And I want to talk today about the connections between language diversity, which is what I specialize in, and biodiversity, which is a field that I'm actually quite new to and I'm learning about, but I have been pushed towards an interest in biodiversity by working on endangered languages, and I'll explain how that happened. To give you some background, there are more than 7,000 languages spoken in the world today, and we estimate that 50% of them are endangered and will probably vanish in this century. And most of the world's languages have never been written down or recorded in any form. We do not have a scientific record of them. And so I have specialized for the past 2 decades in studying the world's endangered languages, meeting some of the very last speakers of these languages, recording the knowledge and the wisdom that they choose to share, and bringing it to a global audience, a global platform. So today we're going to take a kind of a whirlwind world tour of many sites around the world where I've done field work and look at endangered languages. I think of the dozen languages I'm talking about today in my presentation, at least 8 or 9 of them are endangered and have very small numbers of speakers, and 2 or 3 of them are stable. So people have wondered whether there's a connection between species endangerment and extinction and language endangerment and extinction. These are parallel extinctions, but there are also some interesting connections among them, and I'll just point out some of those connections. First of all, I would point out that languages are more endangered than species. Secondly, I would point out that we are in a similar state of knowledge with respect to languages as we are to species. What do I mean by that? If you read E.O. Wilson or you talk to a biologist, they will tell you that a very large percentage, in fact, a majority of the plant and animal species that are thought to exist in the world, E.O. Wilson in one of his books says as much as 80%, but I would rely on the biologist present for a more recent number. In any case, they're unknown to science. So the biosphere is basically out there waiting to be noticed, categorized, described scientifically. And in linguistics, similarly, we do not have a scientific record or description of more than perhaps 10% of the world's languages. So we're in a similar state of knowledge with respect to languages as we are to the biosphere. And in both domains, we're in the middle of an extinction crisis. Now, when I said that plants and animals are not known to science, that doesn't mean they're not known to people. And so it turns out that when you meet with indigenous people in their native environments, they tend to have a very high degree of knowledge about every plant and animal species found in their environment. Not necessarily 100%, but a very high percentage. And so it turns out that much, if not most, of what humans know about the environment is knowledge that is only found in small languages that are themselves endangered. So there's a deep connection between language diversity and biodiversity. I'd like to start talking our world tour of language diversity and biodiversity in a place that's very dear to my heart, Tuva, which is located in southern Siberia. And I told my professors in graduate school at Yale that I needed to spend a year living in Siberia in order to write my dissertation, to collect my data on the Tuvan language. And they kindly agreed to let me do this. But my secret agenda was that I was fascinated by nomads. I wanted to live in a nomadic society and experience it from the inside out. And this is me doing my work. Now, as a field linguist, we have certain tools that we bring to the task. And although we do use digital audio recording and digital video recording, you can also do very solid linguistic documentation using only a trained ear and a notebook and pencil. So I'm doing what we call elicitation here in this photo. I'm listening very carefully to the language. With my linguistics training, I can make an accurate phonetic transcription of any sound in any language. I can read my transcription back to the native speaker and they will recognize what I'm trying to say. I can break a word down into its constituent parts, which we call morphemes. I can analyze the syntax, the word order of a sentence, and I can draw a syntactic tree to describe that structure. And so these are some of the tools we have in linguistics. So I was sent off into the field to Tuva with all of these technical academic tools to do my work. My host family realized, however, and pointed out to me on the second day of my stay that I had no useful skills in a nomadic society. And this is true, I had to admit. I don't really know how to ride horses or herd goats or shear sheep or do any of the things that they count on for survival. But I wanted to be useful, and so I was assigned the job of collecting yak manure. These are yaks. They're very shy, skittish creatures. They wander, they eat grass, they poop a lot, and there is no other source of fuel in this environment. This is a low biodiversity environment. It has mostly just grass. And so I would go out following the yaks, and I had a special tool that I would use to mash down the yak poop. And then I would come back 2 days later and flip it over to the other side so it could dry. And then I would come back a couple days later wearing a special basket and put it into the basket and bring it back to the yurt where it was stacked up in different geometric formations. And I had a page in my field notebook called 100 Words for Shit, which was an exaggeration, but I did learn from this task that they had, at the different stages of metamorphosis of this animal product, they had different names for it. So through this very humble task, I began to appreciate the richness of the lexicon. Now, one of the other things I noticed in Tuva was that, this is the landscape, they had an intricate and complex set of names for features of the landscape that I had never thought about. They have a word in Tuvan, E, which means the short side of a hill. And if you look at hills or mountains, you notice that they're asymmetrical, and typically one side is shorter than the others, and therefore steeper. And so if you're riding a horse or you're carrying something, you want to avoid the short side of the hill. I didn't have this concept prior to learning it in Tuvan. Although I can express it in English, we don't have a specific word for it. But once you know this, it starts to shape your thinking. You start to notice features of the landscape and pay attention to the landscape differently. One of the problems I faced very early in my stay was learning how to say go in Tuvan, which is something that you think you should be able to learn on day one if you're learning any language. Well, they have 5 words in Tuvan for go, and I would try out different words, and people would either laugh at me or they would correct me, but they couldn't explain to me what the system was. So I'm going to rely on your local knowledge of geography for a moment. In order to say go in Tuvan, first we need to know whether we're going by some means of locomotion or on foot. Then we need to know where the nearest river or stream is relative to where we're sitting. So I will ask you, locals, to please point out to me where the nearest river or stream is. Okay, there seems to be a consensus. Now we need to know the direction that the current is flowing in that river or stream. Okay, again, a consensus. Now we need to know our trajectory. Are we going with current, against current, or across current? And based on that matrix of information, you select one of the words for go. I invited a Tuvan friend to visit me here in New York a few years ago, and he asked me on the second day where the river was because he needed to calibrate his orientation system. So Tuvans are constantly paying attention to the riverine orientation system. Now, if you are going somewhere in Tuva, it is customary to consult a shamaness or a seer, someone who will do a divination ritual for you and tell you whether it's an auspicious day to travel or maybe it's a bad luck day and you should stay home. And in talking with shamanesses and shamans, I sensed a very different way of talking about time that was confusing to me initially. Whenever they talked about the past, they used a set of body part metaphors relating to the forehead and to the nose. And when they talked about the future, they used a different set of metaphors relating to the scapula and the spine. It took me a while to figure it out, but Tuvans think about the past as being situated in front of them physically, where they can see it, they can observe it. The future is sneaking up behind you. You can't see it. And so it's impossible in Tuvan to say, I'm looking forward to next week. You're actually looking forward to last week. Next week is behind you. So they've taken this space-time metaphor mapping that we think of as very natural, and they've reversed it, and that's their worldview. Eventually, I was promoted because I gained some skills, and I was promoted to assistant goat herder. And this is my host family in Western Mongolia, and they spend a lot of time each day caring for their goats. And this required a whole new vocabulary. And so I want to play for you a video clip of my host family teaching me some of the 24 names they have in the Tuvan language that describe colors and patterns of domesticated goats. So that's not just a lexicon, it's also what we call a taxonomy. It's a hierarchically ordered set of knowledge. I would also call it a technology. That is, it is an adaptation to this specific environment. Think about if you're a goat herder with hundreds of goats. Knowing these labels allows you to look out over your goat herd and very efficiently pick out individual goats using these descriptors. Many different academic products came out of my stay in Tuva. I did actually write that dissertation that I had promised. I wrote a grammar of the language, which is a technical description I wrote a dictionary of the language. I published a second dictionary for the Tuvan community. I wrote about it in National Geographic magazine and in my book that Mike mentioned, When Languages Die. These were all kind of academic products, but they were less interest and use to the community itself. And so what I've tried to do since then in my work is also produce things that benefit the host community. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later when I mention the talking dictionaries. Now, as I mentioned, I had gone to Tuva with the best possible academic training, and in modern linguistics, with theories like Noam Chomsky's theory of universal grammar and so forth, we are taught that all you need to do to write a description of a language is to have a speaker. It can be a single speaker. It could even be yourself. And you can sit in a room with that speaker and you can query them. You can ask them questions. And if you ask the right questions, you can extract the grammar from their brain, as it were, and you can put it in a book, you can examine it. It's a kind of a scientific object of inquiry. And living with the nomads in Tuva radically transformed me personally, but also me as a scientist, because I no longer believe this. It turns out that languages are deeply embedded in their environment, and they are connected in many ways such that you cannot extract a language from its environment and understand it fully. So lessons from Tuvan is that language is not contained within the brain. It is capacious, it spills out of the head. Includes grammar, yes, but also landscapes, goats, rivers, plants, metaphors, time and space. And that the knowledge base, there is a vast environmental knowledge base out there in the world that we barely know about. And it is eroding, it is vanishing, and it is only accessible from an internal vantage point if you get inside the language. And so this is how I became an environmentalist. The Tuvans, this was not my training, the Tuvans pushed me in this direction. They made me realize that their language could not be analyzed or understood apart from its environment. And so I've kept those lessons with me and subsequently and traveled all over the world looking at this question. And so today I'd like to bring you to various places. We're going to go to Siberia again. We're going to go to Australia, Micronesia, India, and end up in Vanuatu. And in each of these places, I want to pose the question, what is environmental knowledge? What does it look like? How does it manifest itself in these different societies? And then I want to zoom out and ask a larger question, what is the environmental wisdom of these communities? What is their philosophy of sustainability? This is what might help us save the planet if we manage to do that. And so I think it's very important. Okay, the map that I've used to guide me over the years in deciding where I wanted to do research is the so-called Language Hotspots Map, which I launched in 2007 and published in National Geographic magazine. To date, my team and I have identified 24 language hotspots around the globe. 13 of them are shown here. And so I use this as a guide of where to kind of focus my energy and attention. The language hotspot has a very high diversity of languages. It has high levels of endangerment, and it has low levels of scientific documentation. And so we're going to visit several hotspots today. We're going to go to Siberia. We're going to go to Melanesia, Oceania as well. We're going to go to India. And along the way, in each place, we're going to see different scenarios for language endangerment. We're going to see the importance of language diversity, and we're going to look for environmental knowledge and environmental wisdom. So we're already in Siberia in a sense because I've been talking about Tuva, but after working on Tuvan, I branched out and I worked on a number of very small, highly endangered indigenous Siberian languages. So I just want to mention 3 of them that are quite remarkable. The Toju people, they have fewer than 500 speakers of the language. The Tofa people, who have maybe 25 speakers of their language, and the Us people, who have only 7 speakers. This is a nearly extinct language. They're all related languages, which was a big advantage. So since I had learned Tuvan, these are sister languages, and so I was able to step into these communities and already have at least a 50% comprehension of what I was hearing. They live in one of the most isolated places on Earth. You cannot get further from the ocean anywhere on Earth than the very center of Siberia. This is the geographic center of the Asian continent. And we've been talking about Tuvan, and now we're going to travel northward into ever more remote areas. We're going to visit the Toju people, the Tofa people, and then the Us people. The Toju people are the world's southernmost herders of domesticated reindeer. And they don't eat the reindeer meat. They use reindeer primarily for transportation to go hunting, and secondarily for milk, which they produce in small quantities. And so this young man, Azir Shingalai, as an expert, growing up in this culture as an expert on reindeer, he would also happen to know the Reindeer Taxonomy of the Toju people. And the Reindeer Taxonomy classifies reindeer according to their 4 most important characteristics, not whether they bring presents or not. And so what are the 4 characteristics of reindeer? Well, it's their age, their sex, their rideability, because they use them for transportation, and what did I say? Age, sex, rideability, and fertility. And so that applies to both sexes, actually. And so they have a very efficient system. If you say chare in this language, you are referring to a 3-year-old male castrated rideable reindeer. And so they're packaging all of this information into a single label. This is a taxonomy. And this allows them to essentially do genetic engineering on their reindeer, because they manipulate they decide which reindeer are going to breed, what are they going to be used for. So this is a very impressive taxonomy, and it shows an underlying technology. Now, I have many recordings of the Toju people talking about nature. This is the constant theme in their songs, their stories, and I want to skip out of my presentation just for 1 minute to play a song sung by Elizaveta Kenden. And I hope this works. She's singing. I'll show you what she's singing in a moment. Here she is. What surprised me about Toju songs, stories, narratives was that although I viewed the Toju people as living in one of the harshest environments on earth, the constant theme in their songs and stories is one of abundance. They view themselves as living in an environment of great abundance. And this song, where she says, I grew up cool with my pelts and squirrels abundant, I grew up sated, with pine nuts and berries abundant, I grew up sated. It's a kind of song of environmental pride, I would say, and the feeling of wealth and abundance that they have. This was surprising to me. The birch trees that she's talking about, and we have some beautiful samples over here, which I would invite you to look at after the talk, are very crucial to them because they use them to make all kinds of containers. Before they had metal or any other, or plastic or other materials, all of their food containers and important containers were made out of birch bark like this. So this is a very important species to them. Here are 3 of the samples that are in the virtual herbarium, and I have all 3 of them over here, and I invite you to take a look at them. I would note, however, that the limitations of herbarium samples. So the part of the birch that is most important to the Toju people, which is the bark that they make this out of, is not actually able to be included in these particular herbarium samples. So just something to think about. They would recognize, if the Toju people looked at these samples, they would recognize what they are, but they wouldn't see the part of the plant that is useful to them. Moving just slightly further north, the Tofa people, very similar culture, also reindeer herders and hunters, and they also use reindeer for transportation to go hunting. They also have a very intimate relationship with the birch, and it goes like this. So they start out by harvesting the birch, then they make what you could consider musical instruments from it. So they have 2. They have the murgu, which is this helix-shaped horn made out of birch bark, and they have another one called the ediski, which is a small whistle that you hold in your mouth that makes a high-pitched sound. They use these 2 musical instruments to alter the ambient sound environment in the forest, and therefore to affect the behavior of animals. If you play these instruments correctly, you can attract an elk, for example, or a wild pig. They will come running to this sound, and then your chances of being successful in hunting increase. So there's this interesting synergy between the plants, things that they make from the plants, the sound environment that they manipulate, and hunting, and therefore survival. But something's missing from this relationship, and what's missing, as I discovered in my research, is the timing. You have to know a lot about when to do these activities. It's not enough to know how to do these activities. And the timing comes from the TOFA calendrical system, which is a plant-based calendar. This is Marta Kongarayeva, one of my consultants, who told me this gathering calendar. And it's remarkable that of the 12 names of months that she could remember, 8 of them are directly related to plants. So they have February is Big Log Month, Tree Bud Month, Good Birch Bark Collecting Month is April, May is Edible Lily Root Month, June is Bad Birch Bark Collecting Month. And so you've kind of missed the boat. If you wait until June to collect your birch bark, it's not going to be supple enough to make these containers or to make this hunting horn that you need to make. And so this is crucial. The timing is crucial for determining these seasonal activities, and their calendar reflects this obsession with plant life. This is, the saranki is the plant that is referenced in August, collecting. In May, we have digging Edible Lily Root Month, and in August, we have collecting Edible Lily Root Month. These are 2 different activities. And the saranki is a plant that is of great significance to them, and I have 3 samples of it over here on the table, which I would invite you to look at. So it's a marker of one of the lunations, on months on the lunar calendar, and it is also subsistence for them. They eat the roots. One of the samples over here actually has the lily bulbs, which taste a little bit like a mild onion, and this is an important element in their diet. The Tofa people also constantly are talking about themes of nature and abundance in their songs and stories. This is Marta Kongarayeva, who told me the plant-based calendar. She also sang this little song for me: I'll take a shortcut and collect pine nuts. I'll take a shortcut and catch a wood grouse, take a shortcut and catch a quail. Marta is one of the most accomplished hunters I've ever met in my life, bar none. She spent her entire life from a very young age hunting with reindeer and dogs out alone, out in the remote Siberian forest. And it was nothing to her to go out on a 2 or 3 week trek around the Siberian forests with just her gun and her dogs. And so she knew every element of the forest. And so it's this kind of knowledge that I've been most interested in and that is vanishing rapidly. As I mentioned before, both Marta and Elizaveta had these constant themes of abundance, and specifically, I want to point out that they both mentioned pine nuts, and so I was also interested in finding in the herbarium a sample of these pine nuts. This is a very important forest product for the Tofa people. Nowadays, Russians also make pine nut flavored vodka, in case you want to try that. They make various candies out of it, various teas out of it. They have a word in the Tofa language that it's an onomatopoetic word that describes the slight crackling sound that the pine cones make when they're disgorging their nuts. Shalorar. It means precisely that and nothing else. So they're so attuned to the plant acoustics, you could call them, of the environment. This is just one example of it. Okay, we've looked at Tuva, Toju, Tofa. We're going to go a little further north now to the Us people. There's only 7 speakers of this language left. They live, Us is their name for themselves, their ethnic group. It's also the name for the river that they live on, the Us River, and it's also the name for their language. So they're themselves, their river, their language. These are all connected in that name. This is an aerial view of the Us River. It meanders a lot, changes its course over time. And this is Anna and Alexei Baidashev. When I started working with them in 2007, at that time, they were the very last married couple who spoke the Us language in their house. So their home was the last household left where people were speaking the language on a daily basis. The other remaining speakers lived in solely Russian-speaking households. The Us people are intimately familiar with their riverine environment. All of the stories they tell are about fishing, moose hunting. They have a very rich oral literature, oral narrative. This is Vasya Gabov, also a lifelong hunter and truly an amazing person who sat down some years ago and decided that he would write his language. This is an unwritten language. It had never been written down. He in a very ingenious way, took what he knew from Russian literacy and he repurposed the Russian alphabet to suit the sounds of his language, and he came up with a writing system for the language. Quite remarkable accomplishment for someone with a third grade formal education. And we used his alphabet to publish a storybook in the language. All the stories are about hunting and fishing. That is the obsessive theme of Us culture. I had many opportunities to sit down with elders in the Us community, and they were kind enough to allow me to videotape some of these dialogues and conversations. So I want to play for you a very short dialogue between Vasya Gabov, the inventor of the writing system, Ivan Skoblin, who's since passed away, and Anna Badeeva. And I think you'll recognize what the theme is. I'll just play it for you here. So they're really struggling here, and Anna makes this wonderful gesture of forgetting. They're struggling to recall the ecological calendar, which we know existed. Based on extrapolating from neighboring groups, they would have governed their yearly activities by such a calendar, but they can't remember it. They know that they used to know it, that it was important, that it linked them to their environment in various ways. They can't remember it. So this is a picture here, a snapshot of the erosion of knowledge that I've been talking about. We're going to take a big leap now from Australia, where we've looked at Tuvan, Toju, Tofa, and Us, to briefly to Australia. I don't consider myself an expert on Australian Aboriginal cultures, but what little I've been able to visit and see of them, they're remarkable in their environmental knowledge. And so I just want to show you a few slides. This is Charlie Mongolda, who's the last speaker of the Armour Dog language. He's a speaker of 13 languages total, with English being the 13th of that set. So polyglots are very common in these cultures. Charlie told us many stories about the Dreamtime, the mythical rainbow serpent, and so much of the environmental knowledge of the Aboriginal peoples is bound up in their mythology, the songlines, the Dreamtime, and so forth. This is Neal Mackenzie. He's a member of the Yaru people who live in this kind of, I wouldn't call it desert, but it's kind of scrubland. There's probably a technical term for it, I don't know, along the western coast of Australia. To my eye, it looked like quite a hostile environment, but for Neal, it was like a grocery store. You know, he could at any point he was walking, he could tell me exactly how deep the water table was, and if I didn't believe him, he would say it's this deep, and I said, oh, really? And then he would say, yep, watch, and he would dig a hole precisely this deep, and there was water. And so he had this uncanny knowledge of the environment. I want to play a little video clip for you in which he talks about the uses of an important plant in their environment.
Go out in the rocky pools or the fish traps. We had so much water in the bottom there, of the rocks, and a big pool of water around it. We take this plant out here from the bottom, and we get these roots. We crush them up with a stone and break it off, mash it up, mix it with the sand, walk in the pools, put much water underneath. A couple of seconds later, the fish come up upside down. But it's actually not a poison. It gives off a bit of a milky sap, and it coats the gills and stops the oxygen coming in from the water into the gills, so they float upside down. I don't know what.
So that, again, is a really interesting combination of plants, animals, and human ingenuity. If I had to characterize the environmental wisdom of the Yaru people, I would say that it is all about experimentation. They know the elements in their environment, but they don't stop there. They look for combinations in which different elements can be applied against others to yield some added value, and this is an example of that. And my favorite quote from Neal was, because I had gone there with linguist Greg Anderson, and when we introduced ourselves to Neal, we said, hey, we're linguists. We're here to study your language. Would you care to sit down with us and share some words in your language? And he said, no. We're going to go out on country. And he explained it later. He said, I know you came here to ask about the language, but this is what you need to see. If I don't show you the land, you won't understand the language. It's connected to it. We're going to skip again now to Micronesia, a place where I know Mike Balick has worked a lot, and I've had the privilege of working there on a couple of small atolls, Mokil and Nukuoro. Here they are. They're quite remote. They have very small populations. On Mokil Atoll, I was out swimming in the lagoon on a Sunday afternoon, and I met Carolina John, shown standing here. And she was out in a traditional outrigger canoe that her grandfather had built. And she and her friend were doing something called breath hold diving. This is a remarkable feat. They can actually dive 10 meters or more down into the lagoon with no apparatus. In fact, they were diving exactly as you see them here, wearing skirts and jewelry and with their hair up like that, and they put a knife in their teeth and they dive down 10 meters and they pry loose clams and shellfish. To them, it was like a walk in the park, this incredibly strenuous activity. And they explained to me some things about the ecosystem of the lagoon, the different types of creatures that they were harvesting. And so I was impressed immediately on Mokil Island by what seemed to be the superhuman abilities relating to the environment. We also sat down with Ichiro John, who was the eldest inhabitant of the atoll at that time, and did an interview with him. And in the course of the interview, I asked Ichiro if he could tell me the origin story. I said, is there a creation story about this island? Because from the Pacific Islands that I've worked on, every island has a creation myth, and I thought this would be a wonderful thing to record. He adamantly said no. He said, we are all Christians on this island, and we only believe in the Bible creation story, and we don't tell the old stories anymore, which indicated to me that there were old stories. So I persisted, and I was disappointed, but I persisted. And the next day, as we were about to leave the island, these two young men came along, Edward Mullins and Gary Albert, and just kind of offhandedly I said, do you guys happen to know, is there a creation story about this island? And Edward said, of course, everybody knows that story. That's the lazy giant story. I said, okay, would you be willing to tell the lazy giant story on camera? And sure enough, they sat down and they told the story. I'll play just a short clip of them. They're speaking Mokilese, and then I'll tell you the plot of the story afterwards. So, the lazy giant, named Leduc, shares the island, the atoll, with the Mokil people, and it is an uneasy relationship. When they need him in an emergency, they can wake him up by beating on a rock that makes a sound like a bell, and he will wake up and he will defend the island, for example, by plucking up entire coconut trees with a single hand and hurling them at pirate ships. So he is their defender. At the same time, he's a burden on them. He's very lazy, and he eats too much. And this is a constant source of tension and anxiety on the island. So one day, the men of the island decide to challenge him, and everyone really, to a breath hold diving contest, which I just mentioned. And the challenge was, who can go down under the ocean and stay down the longest? That seems like a cool competition, right? So they all went down, and of course, Leduc won the contest because he held his breath for 3 years underwater. But in the meantime, the coral encrusted him, and when he decided he was ready to come up, he couldn't break free. He was trapped by the coral, and so he died under the ocean, and in his struggles, he broke the island apart into 3 pieces, which it remains to this day. So they have this notion that they're living on the body of their giant friend. So if I had to think about what is the environmental wisdom of the Mokil people, it seems to be something like, don't be lazy, acquire what seem to be superhuman skills with respect to the environment, right? And don't consume too much. So this is all encapsulated in this little story. Moving just slightly further across in Micronesia to the atoll of Nukuoro, which looks like this. It's one of the most beautifully shaped atolls. It resembles to the Nuku'oro people a strand of pearls, and they have a legend about how the founders of Nuku'oro Atoll the rainbow people came down from the sky in their double-hulled canoe, and they were looking for a place to farm pearls, and they found this to be the perfect place for that activity. I was very lucky to be able to take some of my students from Swarthmore College to visit the Nuku'oro community a few years back, and we had a wonderful time there. These are a couple of my students, and I want to credit this discovery, it was a discovery to us, the Nuku'oro people already knew this, to my students Emily Drummond and Lydia Ding. They had the silly notion that they could find out how do you say coconut in the language, and so they asked their host family, how do you say coconut in Nuku'oro? Now, coconuts are everywhere in this society. They literally fall on your head, and they're consumed on a daily basis, and they were met with blank looks. What do you mean, coconut? It turns out that the Nuku'oro have no word for coconut. This is what we call a covert category in linguistics. What they have is 8 different words that describe the different life stages of a coconut. And so you have to know which these are the life stages. And then Lydia and Emily were very industrious, and they went out and they collected all of the coconut life stages, and they split them open, and they took these beautiful photographs. And this is a kind of interesting environmental knowledge that is very fine-grained, and they're actually they're lacking a superordinate term that would mean coconut of any life stage. But what they have is this lexicon that describes coconuts at every life stage. Okay, we've been skipping around a lot. We're going to come to India now briefly to look at a language called Koro Aka. It has fewer than 1,000 speakers. I've been working in the Koro Aka community for the past 10 years or so, and very recently had a visitor from this community here at the garden. I'll show a picture of him in a moment. This is Abamu Degio from the community. This is her house. This is where I did a lot of my field work. You see in the background her husband is preparing plants to weave into baskets. And I just want to play a little clip of what the Koro Aka language sounds like. So the Koro, actually I said he was preparing plants to weave baskets, but I think it may have been for a different activity. The Koro spend what seems like an inordinate amount of time, energy, and creativity building something that would seem to me, or to outsiders, to be useless. And those are these incredibly intricate spirit houses. They build these multiple times during the year, and they never disassemble them. So once they've built a spirit house, it just sits there until it collapses, and they build another one on a different site. They build a new one every 3 months. This takes hundreds and hundreds of hours of labor with 10 different species of bamboo, and they spend many hours shaping and sculpting and carving the bamboo into these intricate shapes, all to appease the spirit world. They build one type of spirit house for good spirits from which they hope to get benevolence and abundance, and they build a second type for bad spirits which they hope to appease and ward off so that they don't mess with them. So this is a very important plant-based spiritual activity that goes on year-round in these communities. I was very fortunate in 2013, with the help from the Smithsonian Institution, to be able to invite a delegation of Koro people to the Folklife Festival, which takes place on the National Mall every summer. And they built 2 spirit houses. You can see them there. They're mini versions, right on the National Mall, where 1 million people who came to this exhibit were able to see these incredible structures. And they performed various songs and dances and rituals around this. And the young man in the very front, Kandu Degio, was here 3 weeks ago at the New York Botanical Garden working with me. And so they've channeled a lot of this knowledge that they have into a series of online presences. So this is a young man in the community, Anthony Degio, talking about medicinal plants. I have many hours of video with him. He's someone who can walk down a 100-meter length of trail in the jungle, and on that 100 meters, he's going to find a minimum of a dozen plants that he knows. He knows the names of, he knows how and when to harvest them, he knows the medicinal uses of them. It's a very biodiverse, rich environment, a very linguistically and knowledge-diverse environment. And they've shared a lot of this information. So on my YouTube channel, I have many, many videos of the Koro people talking about their environmental knowledge. As I mentioned, they've also been working with me to construct a talking dictionary, which is an online presence for their language. And so I'm really, if I had to sum up the Koro people's sort of environmental wisdom, it would be something like, don't just put forward effort for survival or subsistence. There is a whole effort of dimension that has to be devoted to the spiritual. And the connection between plants and the spirit world is crucial for the Koro people, to the extent that they're willing to devote hundreds of hours of time and effort to this activity. And that seems to be their environmental philosophy. Okay, I'm going to wrap up my talk, coming back to the place where I've been working with Mike Balick and Greg Plunkett, and it's been my great honor and privilege to work with the teams from NYBG in Vanuatu, an area in the world that is not only a biodiversity hotspot, but is the #1 language hotspot in the world, because in a population of 250,000 people, they have 113 languages. So there's nowhere on earth that has a higher ratio of languages to people. And we've been working primarily on 2 islands, Anaeum or Anaichum and Futuna, also on Tana Island. These 2 languages each have a population that's close to 1,000. I don't know the exact population. And I've been working very closely with the community in their effort to digitize their language, to cross the digital divide, to create an internet presence, and to preserve their knowledge. And on both Futuna and Anaichum Islands. And so I want to play for you just a little clip. This is from Anaichum Island, where there's an environmental activity going on, and then I kind of inject myself into the situation to turn it in a linguistic direction, and you'll see what happens there. This is Orion Namu and Chris Nevahev from Anaichum, Kiamu Island. What did you catch today? That's me. Clams. Can you tell me the name in language? What about in language?
Niri? One's Niri. Nithubo. Nithubo. You remember? Tropa? Nithubo.
Nethupo. So that's a little dialogue that we have around environment and linguistics. And also, I just want to point out, lest you think that Orion is somebody who only leads a traditional lifestyle. He has a degree in physics from the University of the South Pacific. He's choosing to live this lifestyle, right? You wouldn't guess that by meeting him, but there are many people in this community who really can straddle both worlds. They're thoroughly global citizens, and at the same time, they're the protectors and the preservers of traditional knowledge. And this is something I've come to admire greatly about these communities. This is over just a few miles away on Futuna Island, where I had many conversations with the fish expert, Anselon Saru. Greg and Mike were on this same expedition, and they met him. They do a lot of fishing. Their livelihood depends on fish. The island has very limited carrying capacity, but if you add in the sea, the ocean environment, then it has almost unlimited abundance. Well, there's a really important moment in the life of a Futuna fisherman is catching a tuna fish. And it's such a big deal that they have a 4-part song cycle that they perform, a song and dance cycle that they perform every time they catch a tuna fish. So I would like to share with you the Futuna tuna song and dance cycle, a little part of it, and then I'll explain a little bit more about its meaning and how it connects humans to plants to the marine environment. I'd like you to think about that excitement and joy the next time you eat a tuna sandwich. And it's such a remarkable moment. And it's a complex cultural performance. And I want to credit Sean Thackerdine, who was an employee here at the Garden, with helping me understand what was going on in this environment. We documented this together. When they catch a tuna, they're offshore. They're out in the boats. And they sing the first verse of the song out to sea. They begin this song. And in that verse of the song, they mention a specific plant whose fruits fall into the ocean and float out to sea. And it gets mentioned in that first verse of the song. So they're singing about catching a tuna, but they mention this plant that situates them at a specific location. The second verse of the song, which includes dancing, as you saw here, is sung on the beach after they beach their canoe and they bring the tuna up onto the beach. And on the beach, there's a particular vine with purple flowers that grows, and it gets mentioned in the second stanza of the song. The third stanza is sung on the pathway that leads on an incline from the beach up to the village. And by this time, the people in the village have heard the ruckus, and they begin preparing to cook this tuna fish that they know is coming up from the beach. And in that third verse, they mention a plant that grows on the pathway along the way up to the village. The fourth stanza of the song is when they're up in the village with the tuna, and everyone is celebrating the catch of this prize tuna. And there's a tree that grows up in the village that is mentioned in that. So we have a 4-part song and dance cycle about tuna, about the marine environment, subsistence, survival, and it is interwoven with plants at every stage. Now, the irony of all this is that Anselon and his fellow fishermen will not be allowed to eat even a single bite of this fish that they have caught. There is a strict taboo on fishermen eating the prize fish that are caught. They have to be shared very strictly according to kinship networks around the entire community. Everyone else is going to enjoy this feast except for the people who caught it. Well, what do you do if you've caught a tuna fish and you're not allowed to eat it? Well, Anselon puts it on his social media. So he's an avid user of social media, and he showed me on his tablet device every fish he had ever caught. And this was remarkable because we used his own documentation in addition to a published book of Pacific fishes as a way to collect the names. And he sat down with me over a course of a couple days and named 250 species of fish, which I think is quite a remarkable knowledge base. Another thing that the Futuna people know about, but they're also aware of losing this knowledge a little bit, is that when the fishermen do go out to sea, they don't have instruments like compasses or maps. They have to rely on something much more traditional, which they call the wind compass. And in this photo, we have an elder of the community, Yaugane Misikofe, who is reconstructing and remembering this wind compass and transmitting it to the younger generation who had only a very partial knowledge of it. After we finished this session, which went on for, I think, 2 hours, we had this schematic. This is the complete wind compass of Futuna Island. If you're out sailing and you feel the wind blowing at your back or maybe at your front in a particular direction, you know where you are, and you'll be able to make landfall using this cognitive tool, this cognitive mapping. And so we were able to document the entire wind compass And I've overlain it on a Google Earth platform so that when you visit our Futuna Talking Dictionary, you can click on the name of any particular wind. So you can click on, for example, Tonga or Retumatonga, this one. And if you click on it, you're brought into a Google Earth view of what the island looks like from that perspective. So if you're sailing along and you have Retumatonga blowing at your back, this is the vista that you would see, assuming it's not cloudy. If it is cloudy, you'd be very thankful that you know the wind compass, because that's what's actually going to get you back home. Much of this knowledge, including the 250 names of fish provided by Anselon, have gone into our Futuna Talking Dictionary. They are avid technologizers of the language and doing things that are quite remarkable to preserve it. I also, before we leave Vanuatu, and the last thing is I want to mention the connection between climate, plants, and space architecture. And this is a series of photographs taken by Greg Plunkett, and I want to acknowledge him. They face cyclones on a yearly basis, even more frequently than that, and they've come to realize recently that more modern or contemporary architecture made of corrugated metal or cement does not provide protection from cyclones. And I was not there, thankfully, but both Mike Balick and Greg Plunkett were on Tana Island during a cyclone and in a building that collapsed. So they can attest to this. And so they've begun to reiterate and reinvest their energies in recalling and transmitting the knowledge of how to build cyclone houses. And when we were there last year, we were able to witness this process from beginning to end, from collecting the plants to curing and preparing them in whatever way they needed to be. For example, these vines have to be roasted over the fire, creating the skeleton of the house, creating every stage of the cyclone house, which is a survival tool for this particular environment. People who sheltered in cyclone houses during the cyclone survived and lived to tell about it. And I heard many testimonials from community members. Building it is very complex, not only architecturally and from an engineering standpoint because of what it has to do and the extreme conditions it has to perform under, but also from a botanical standpoint. I believe it's something like a dozen different plants go into the making of this house. They all have to be harvested in a specific way at a specific place, prepared in a specific way. And so we were able to, by observing this process, collect the names of all these plants. All right, I'm summing up now. We've been a kind of a quick tour around the world, and in each place we've looked at different manifestations of environmental knowledge. In Siberia, we saw that it's connected to topography, to rivers and landscapes, also to calendrical systems, to animal classification system taxonomies, and it can be expressed in song. In Australia, we saw plant use, myth. We saw the ethos of experimentation. In Micronesia, again, we saw mythology, we saw human skill, we saw botanical knowledge. In India, we saw devotion, religious knowledge, and plant use. And in Vanuatu, we saw all these things and more. And each of these places, in addition to have a knowledge base, has what I would call environmental wisdom. So let me recap what I think that is. In Siberia, I think the environmental wisdom is one of abundance, and take whatever you need, but take it appropriately according to the seasonal calendar and on your designated clan lands where you are allowed to hunt and gather. So they have a sense of abundance, but appropriateness. In Australia, they have an environmental wisdom, a philosophy of experimentation. It's an austere environment. They need to know every single plant and animal to survive, but they don't stop there. They look for novel combinations that will add value among the interactions and the synergies among these things. In Micronesia, if I had to sum up theirs is one of anxiety. There's not an ethos of abundance so much as one of anxiety about exceeding the carrying capacity of the home island. And the story of Leduc the lazy giant tells you this anxiety of resource depletion. And so again, they're able to survive, but they have to be very careful. They have to be very cautious with their resources. In India, the environmental wisdom is don't neglect the spiritual. In other words, devote as much time as you need to hunting and gathering, but also devote a significant chunk of your time to making things out of plants that will interact appropriately with the spirit world. In Vanuatu, all of these things and more. Immense local knowledge, highly specialized, surpassing what scientists know. The scientists are actually kind of playing catch up to the knowledge base that we know exists in Vanuatu. This is what has made me an environmentalist. I started out as a linguist interested in grammatical structures, and by spending time in these communities around the world who constantly brought me back again and again to the themes of environmentalism, of hunting, of fishing, of gathering plants. And so I've been dragged along, and I've become an environmentalist. And now, even more so, I've had the good fortune of being able to work with botanists and ethnobotanists here at the garden. And it's been a great thing. And as I said at the beginning, if we manage to save the planet, it's going to be thanks to precisely this knowledge base. We're not going to be able to do it with our science alone. I've recently launched something that I call environmental linguistics. Don't try to read the small print, but I'd be happy to share this with you. And also invite you to take a look at a copy of my book and the wonderful herbarium specimens from Vanuatu, from Siberia, and I think from somewhere else, but I'm forgetting. And thank you so much for the opportunity. Yes, in the very back there.
I'm sorry, I came a little late, but I wondered, when the definition of language, how does dialect play into that? And when you say, so about 113 languages, do you really
Yep.
mean what we would think of as a distinct language?
Yes, yes I do. And it's really interesting to me. I lecture publicly all over the U.S. and the world, and this is the number one question that people ask in Q&A. People seem to be intrigued or even vexed by this question. What's the difference between a language and a dialect? We don't really have a firm answer for it.
So you say you're fluent in a language, right?
Right.
But then how does dialect play into
Yeah. There's a test of mutual comprehension. Can you put two speakers in a room and can they have a meaningful dialogue? But that could sometimes be asymmetrical, where one speaker would say, I understand everything that person's saying, but the other person says, I don't understand anything they're saying. So we don't have an absolute test for it. Often it's socially constructed, so a community decides that the variety they speak is different enough, and they identify their ethnicity with it, that they want it to be considered a separate language. But we don't always have a good answer to that question. And many languages exist on a continuum where you can understand the two neighboring languages, but if you go a little further along the continuum, understanding breaks down. In the case of Vanuatu, yes, 113 languages, and that's probably an undercount, as I'm learning, because as I work on some things in Vanuatu that have been identified as a language, it turns out that they have immense dialect variation within them. So we don't know. I said there are 7,000 languages in the world. That's an undercount. And as we continue to do better documentation, that number is going to increase, even though we're in the middle of a language extinction event. Thank you. Yes?
Two questions, if I can remember them. One, Chomsky, when he developed his theory, how much had he traveled and what had he looked at? Do you know?
I love that question. That's a bit of a sore point with Chomsky's supporters, one of whom told me once that I really ought to believe in universal grammar precisely because Professor Chomsky had spoken with many speakers of languages in his office at MIT. And I found that funny. I don't know if it's true or not. But what I do know is that given that we have only sampled 10% of the world's languages, I think it's premature to talk about what might be universal. I don't rule out that there are universal structures in languages, but we don't know yet. And what has happened in the past is that as soon as someone proposed something that they thought was a universal, a couple years after that, a language popped up that contradicted that theory. So it's a little early to talk about universals, but of course, it is within the purview of linguistics to document every single language in the world, and we need more linguists. So we're not even close to that goal.
Thank you. And what is the essence of what designates, say on an island like you're talking about, one language is different from another?
Ethnic identity is very crucial. So if you visit two villages and they're 5 miles apart, and you ask the people in the villages, what language do you speak? And they say, we speak the same language as those people in the other village, and you accept that. But they might very well say, we speak a completely different language, even though to my ear, they sound similar. So we leave it up to the societies that speak the languages to kind of think about what the boundaries might be between language and ethnic identity. Yes?
In any of these places, were people willing to share either stories or words that related to encroachments from the outside world?
Oh, that is a great question. That's something I need to investigate more because, of course, I view cultures not as fragile, even though that may have come across in my talk, but I view them actually as highly adaptive and resilient. And so they have strategies for taking on, like I showed you the fisherman on Futuna who used his tablet device to photograph fish. So they have strategies for taking on board encroachments or technologies or cultural influences. Oftentimes, linguistically, this manifests itself as inventing new words for things that come along. So rather than borrowing the word computer from English, you have a society that might invent a word that means brain in a box in their own language. And so this is one strategy is new coinages. So you can look. Also narratives. They have stories. A very kind of crucial question you can ask people in a community, especially the more elderly people, is what's changed? What has changed in your lifetime? What have you observed? And when they start talking about changes, you get all of this information about climate change, differences in temperature, difference in the migration patterns of the fish or the birds. And so that's a very telling question, I would say. So I don't know exactly the answer to your question, but I try to get at that information through various pathways. And the reason is that all of these societies are super attuned to the natural world, probably more attuned than we could detect with scientific instrumentation. They can detect minute changes in the environment, and they're highly sensitized to it. And so,
Not just the environment, the
Yep.
fact that they're shrinking populations of
Yep.
speakers surrounded by huge language groups.
that's right, exactly, yes.
Did they refer to that effort?
Yes,
In a
so-
way that you as a linguist
Yes.
would find very
Yes,
telling.
yes. And they use different metaphors. So I've had people say, our language is going extinct. Our language is vanishing. Our language is being erased. They're aware of this process of language extinction, and they have different metaphors and ways of talking about it. Yes, thank you. Yes, Canada.
Yeah, I have a question. This is great.
Thank you.
I'm curious about changes in language also linked to changes in environment, which is to say, I was thinking of the OOS or even the calendar system, which they couldn't recall the names.
Right.
Are those activities no longer associated with that time?
Yes, yeah. So it's mutually reinforcing. They are abandoning the activities themselves as they've been sedentarized and put into villages, and they're no longer nomadizing and spending a lot less time in the forest. And the older generation is always commenting on the younger generation and how little they know and how they get lost in the forest. Isn't that funny for someone to get lost? How can you get lost in the forest in Siberia? It was unthinkable to someone like Marta that you could get lost in the vast Siberian forest. She was never lost. And so they're very aware of this sort of depletion, the erosion of knowledge, and they have ways of talking about it and describing it. So, yeah, yes, sir.
I'm going to shout so that people
Please
can hear.
shout, or I'll repeat the question.
Yeah, so I was wondering how you recommend going about learning a language where there isn't a Duolingo. So I'm trying to learn Quechua, and at this point I kind of just have a list of things I've asked a native speaker to translate, but how
Right.
do you, it's not a romantic language, it's not, I can speak Spanish, but there's no.
Right, so you're trying to learn Quechua or Quechua. You have some Spanish. That's a disadvantage. It would be better if you had no Spanish. And also, the ideal scenario would be for you to be able to spend some time in a Quechua or Quechua-speaking community, and also to pay attention. The reason there isn't a Rosetta Stone or a Duolingo for Quechua is that it's a macro language, which means that there are millions of speakers spread across the Andes, but there's no one particular variety that is the standard, and it's a dialect continuum. So Ecuadorian Quechua is different than Bolivian Quechua or Peruvian, and so really wherever you ended up in the Quechua or Quechua speaking community, you could learn their variety of it. And most of them, many if not most of those varieties are not written. They don't use writing, so it would be an oral culture, which would also be a novel experience for you to be in an entirely oral culture, right? So I would just say, working with a native speaker would be
To keep asking how do you say this?
ask questions. Yeah, you're kind of a linguist. You're doing elicitation, which is to ask how they say something, to repeat it back, to train your ear to hear the sounds, train your tongue to produce them. Yeah, you're a linguist.
I can share. I have one long
Yeah.
file on my phone. There's
Yep.
jungle. How do you say mountain? How do you say river? How do you say?
Yeah, you're doing linguistics. So, yes.
In systematics, we look at the mechanisms of speciation and differentiation, and a lot of times they involve isolation or barriers of some sort.
Yes.
Periods of time separated. But anyway, in the tropics, there's also this tremendous coexistence of the sympatry of many, many species.
Mm-hmm.
And so I wonder if it sounds like kind of a scenario you have with languages. That
Yes.
You study what kind of mechanisms of speciation
Yes.
in language.
Yes, and we've relied heavily and borrowed from the biological sciences. That is, we talk about phylogenies in linguistics, which is descent of daughter languages from a common parent language, and we can reverse engineer the changes. So if you look at the Polynesian languages, they have a strong family resemblance. They're distinct languages. Tongan is distinct from Hawaiian, but there's a strong family resemblance. And so we can reconstruct what's called Proto-Polynesian, which nobody ever got around to recording, but we know it had to have existed at one point, and we can reconstruct backwards all of the changes. We can build a family tree using actually phylogenetic models borrowed directly from biology. And in linguistics, we also have horizontal transfer because language contact, and when languages come into contact, they transfer grammatical structures, not only words, but entire grammatical structures between them. And so you're trying to untangle what was horizontally transferred due to language contact versus what was inherited by descent. So it's an interesting set of puzzles. We do use computational methods. I'm not that kind of linguist, but we have some highly computational people in the field who try to sort that out.
So it sounds like you would have jumping genes in linguistics. So you're sort of like taking entire blocks of linguistic blocks and transferring them horizontally.
Yeah, I don't know exactly what the term jumping genes means, but you do have, when languages come into, so Quechua and Spanish, completely unrelated languages, but they've coexisted for centuries, and there's mutual influence in both directions, not only at the level of words, but at deeper linguistic structural levels. So, yes. Yes, sir.
I have a question. If you were talking about the Tubans, they're throat singers.
Yes, and I usually play a clip of Tuvan throat singer.
That's what I was
Apologies that I did not play that today.
And the Mongol, is it closely related? Is it related to Mongol?
So the Tuvans are a Turkic language, so they're related to Uzbek, Kazakh, Kyrgyz, eventually Turkish. But they've been in many, many centuries of alliance and close contact with the Mongolians. So there's a lot of mutual, mostly influence from Mongolian into Tuvan, linguistically and culturally. So they're not a Mongolic language, but they're heavily influenced, I would say.
Okay, so it is.
And they were soldiers in Genghis Khan's army, and they've been allied with the Mongolians for a long time. So.
They were among the barbarian.
Yes, they were the barbarian hordes. Yes, all the Turkic peoples were aligned with Genghis Khan, and they fought, his wars for him. But they kept their languages. They didn't switch over to speaking Mongolian.
Now the others, the Tofa and the Uz, are they related?
Yes, they're also in the Turkic family. So the Turkic family actually emanates from Siberia. That's where it originally began, and Turkey is like the furthest possible outlier of the Turkic language family. Most of the Turkic languages are situated in South Siberia and then in Central Asia. And then you have kind of Turkey, which is exceptional.
We have time for one more question.
Thank you for being such a great audience. You've already asked a question, so yes, I'll take this one. Yes.
I guess it's question to your experiences. How welcoming and trusting did you find the people of these communities you went to, or did you find that they were maybe a little more distrusting?
Yeah. So how welcoming and trusting? It varies by community. I put a lot of effort on the front end of any project. First, before I visit a community, I find everything that's ever been written or published on that community, and I bring a copy of it with me to give to the community. Secondly, we spend a lot of time explaining our project. This is true of the botanists as well. Anytime we go into a community, we have multiple community meetings, presentations, speeches, formalities. We try to understand what the power structure is, whose permission do we need, who's in charge. And so we put a lot of work and effort into gaining the trust and the acceptance of the community, because there's no way we could do linguistic or botanical research without this. They're our partners, and they're the experts. We're there to learn from them. As far as sharing knowledge, I do the same thing in linguistics that I know the botanists do, which is to tell people that we're not after any proprietary or secret or restricted knowledge. We just want general knowledge that they're willing to share, and so that also helps. And finally, as I mentioned, I always try to create added value out of my projects so that it's not just a data extraction exercise. It's not me going somewhere to take data and bring it back, but what can I create for the community? What are their goals for language preservation, and how can I help them? And most frequently, in recent years, the product that I have produced the most often is the talking dictionary. I've done 125 of these for various communities around the world. This allows them to have an internet presence of their own language, their own voice on the internet, and it's something that they can access and use on a smartphone. And so they have a sense of, and they're listed as co-authors, so they have a sense of ownership and intellectual property and control over this material that I'm curating, but I don't own it. So that's all those types of efforts are what make a project like this successful. And I frequently bring members of these communities to the U.S., as I did just a few weeks ago. Yes, Mike?
Could I just suggest that when you're back wherever you're going, your offices, your homes, you Google Nafe Talking Dictionary, because you can see the plants, their names, their uses, and you push a button, and there's a native speaker. A lot of those native speakers are no longer with us. And so the beauty of this is that it combines so many different dimensions. Can you bring it up on?
Yep, I'm working on that right now.
Yeah,
Thank you.
It's just, and when you sit down in one island and you go to a different island, you show them the talking dictionary from the other island, they say, gosh, we
Yep.
really need this here. People get very excited.
Yep. I'm sorry, I don't have access at the moment, but Talking Dictionary, even just Talking Dictionary, I own the domain name, so Talking Dictionary will get you to be able to look at these resources. And as Mike said, they've been very appreciated by the community. They have a sense of ownership and co-authorship over these resources. So.
And when you said you bring back published materials, we were on
Anichum.
and David brought back a dictionary from the 1800s of the Anichumese language,
Yep.
and the chiefs thanked him for bringing back the language to their island. And when they looked at the words, they said, we don't recognize these words. And David explained to me that if we were in a room with Shakespeare, we wouldn't understand what he was saying either.
Right. They recognized some of them. They recognized that language had changed, and they were happy to see this.
Fascinating